Thank you. So when I was reading that paper, what came to my mind is this machine that I had heard about it, and I had seen a video of it. I couldn't put the video on my Beamer slides. I'm not that good. But this is basically something known as the Moniac. It's a combination of money and the ENIAC. Okay, so this was created back in 1949 by New Zealand economist Bill Phillips to illustrate the workings of a Keynesian economy. It's like this huge contraption, and it's a liquid computer where you put the liquids in. There's all sorts of compartments that move, and like the water moves in and all that. Why am I saying that? Because I felt that like the task of a discussant of this paper is like the Moniac came back to life, and I was tasked with reading the instruction manual and figuring out all the plumbing, right? The paper has 47 parameters, and there is a very good chance I miscounted here. Okay, so as a matter of fact, like I thought to myself, well, the Greek language has 24 letters. So basically, how do you get to 47 parameters? The answer is very simple, superscripts, okay? So it's no wonder why I was tasked with being the discussant of this paper. You really need somebody who knows the Greek alphabet here, okay? Now, needless to say, I have a ton of small quibbles with the setup, but if I started that, you guys would all fall asleep. It's also late after skiing and all that, so I'll save that for the authors. I will focus my discussion on a couple of major conceptual issues that I think would be useful for us to kind of think about, and I hope I can help the authors, because I think like there are some points where they make some assumptions that I think are taking away from something that is fundamentally a very interesting and very intricate paper, okay? Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend like very little time summarizing the model because it's a huge model, okay? So I'm not going to do it justice. I'll give you the components, and like I think like fundamentally I'm going to focus on what I think is like genuinely new here, right? So there is something that is, I would call it by now, a kind of standard new Keynesian block, monopolistic producer, price adjustment cost, and all that. Then there's a whole other thing, which is an intermediate sector. To be completely honest, if this was my paper, I might not do it this way. I might just throw out the whole intermediate sector. If you want convenience yields, just stick bonds in the utility function and be done with it. I mean, this adds a lot of complexity, which I don't think is important for your paper. It almost feels you got your previous paper, which was very nice and was about other issues, and you reused it. And it just makes it a little harder on the reader. How does this intermediary sector work? Very briefly, intermediaries here are effectively durable goods producers. The good they produce is called deposits. And normally, when we model a producer, we have a production function. Like something goes in, and that limits how much we can produce. Here, ideally, we would like to produce a lot of deposits. What limits the amount of deposits we can produce is fundamentally regulation in this model. Okay, so all of this, I don't think it's necessary for what the paper is about. What do we have two types of agents, savers and hand-to-mouth consumers. Honestly, like again, why you could have done just with savers, I think for most of the results you want to highlight. And you kind of make some assumptions that in the production function, like there are complements in the production function. Why should like my saving behavior have to do anything with my productivity as a worker? Again, too many things that like then need some defense. You don't need them. Like you add like an additive piece that comes from government expenditure to the utility function of people. If this was expected utilities, that wouldn't matter at all. It would be completely useless. Now that you have Epstein's in, it will. So it raises question, does that make the utility fluctuate? The only thing I want to highlight perhaps out of this massive calibration is that you do need a very high I'm still going to call it risk aversion coefficient. You guys like are fighting hard not to call it the risk aversion coefficient. I'm going to be old-fashioned and say like your aversion to static gambles in Epstein's in, that is the right risk aversion coefficient. And that's fine. The authors do that in an effort to match what I would consider to be an unnecessarily high risk premium on the GDP claim. Last year when I was presenting a paper here, I was trying to convince you that in the cases where an actual claim to GDP was traded, the risk premium of that was actually way smaller than 4%. Okay, now, why am I even highlighting this other than to toot my own horn? it's going to matter a little bit for something I say later, so commit that a little bit to memory, that the model wants like big risk premium, and I think that might play a little bit of a role in the back of the envelope exercise I'm going to do down the road. Now, here's the meat, okay? So what the paper is going to do, it's going to propose a fiscal policy, okay? This fiscal policy is basically going to come out of, this looks reasonable, all right? So most of the time what Vadim called the inaction region, for those of us who come from an investment background, is always optimally determined. Here it's not optimally determined. Okay, so we're going to set a lower delta that doesn't matter for anything, and more importantly, a higher delta upper bar. Forgot to tell you what is delta. It's the debt to GDP ratio. So when we ever cross that big debt to GDP ratio, then we're going to do stuff, all right? And that's captured in these functions f, okay? Now, what do these functions do? These functions, I'm still in the line, right? I'm good with you guys, all right. So these functions f, they're going to basically either start raising taxes or start reducing government expenditure and transfer problems the minute like the debt to GDP goes above a certain level, all right. So then the paper, by the way, for those of you who come maybe have gotten a course in macro recently, macroeconomists would call that a passive fiscal policy. And I'll get back to that, why that may be important for some things maybe later, if we have a little bit of time. Okay, all right, so the basic idea, big new Keynesian model in the background, intermediary sector, again, in my view, I don't think you need it, but okay, it's there. And the main new component is the fiscal policy that is specified just because it sounds reasonable, okay? That if ever debt got to a big level, we do something to rein it back in. Now, the paper does something. This maybe is my biggest, maybe it's my own rigidity, that like I'd like things to be a little bit like old-fashioned here, and I think it would serve you well to keep it old-fashioned on this point, which is the title of the paper is the austerity threshold, and it has to do at what level do you start intervening to make sure debt doesn't blow up, okay? Now, the paper is going to do something where it's going to try to determine this level completely numerically, all right? And here numerically comes with a big N, because the numerics and the theory start interacting to a point that made me a little uncomfortable, I have to say, okay? So here's basically my best understanding of how this upper threshold is determined. Again, the goal is let's find the highest level of this delta bar, this upper austerity, when we're going to kick in austerity, that's not going to make the debt blow up, okay? Blow up. And the way that's going to happen is they're going to set an upper grid on the numerical simulations of the highest possible values that debt can take, and they're going to say, as you push that upper grid, you create, for a fixed delta bar, if you say, I call a given number for this upper delta bar when I'm going to intervene, and then as I start pushing the highest possible value of the debt to GDP ratio I'm going to consider in my simulation, I give my model more time to mean revert. All right, and then they're going to, for different paths that are each 80 years long, what's special about 80 years? There's no like good theoretical justification for that, but okay. In this 80-year simulation path, they're going to say, how many times do I ever hit that biggest upper bound in my simulation, in the grid of values I'm considering? Okay. If I hit it too often, bring the delta bar down. If I don't hit it frequently enough, then I have a little bit of area to push, to keep pushing, 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 until I get to this magical number of 1 out of 50,000 paths. This doesn't happen. Why 50,000? Why 80 years? Why? There's no theoretical justification for that. I think that could like really take away from the paper because it's going to raise some eyebrows. So let me be constructive, okay? So I would propose that the authors, when they determine that threshold, they go back to basics, all right? And what are those basics? I would define a feasible fiscal policy as one that is consistent with what's known as a no-Ponzi scheme condition, all right? What is that no-Ponzi scheme condition? As long as the marginal utility weighted, and I put that in bold for a good reason, the marginal utility weighted of value of debt converges to zero asymptotically, then I would call such a fiscal policy feasible. Remember here, the interesting question is that because you have a Laffer curve and government expenditure can go below zero, you are always in danger that you could be violating this, assuming you take a stance on what is the initial value of debt, which here sounds easy, but what we have in the data is the nominal initial value of debt. We don't have like a good theory of the determination of the initial price level, and with passive policy, we could be in trouble. Let me leave all of this aside. I'll push this. Let's say I start with some assumption on the real value of debt at time 0, and I want to see, given these surpluses that my model is postulating, will that basically create any problems with the no-Ponzi scheme condition? Now, why don't I think that simulations will not catch this? It's getting late, and I'm going to use some I'm going to take, where's Son here? I'm going to take what Son did yesterday and put it on steroids, okay? In the following sense, that when you run simulations under P, under the data generating process, asymptotically that becomes singular to doing the simulations under Q, under the risk neutral measure. So that is, you have to basically be simulating debt under the risk neutral measure, looking at where debt is going asymptotically, and then seeing, just showing the reader that it kind of goes to 0. Now, why do you kind of have to do that? Because otherwise your model might not even have a solution. I know this is too many equations, but here's the idea. In most models that have a representative agent, okay, if you have solved the household problems correctly, then you ought to be imposing a transversality condition, all right? Now, I'm going to claim that in most of these models, if the transversality condition is satisfied, that will, in most cases, satisfy also the no-Ponzi scheme condition for debt. Now, why is that? Because debt is going to have to satisfy, if you iterate it forward, it's going to look like this first equation up there. The representative agent's transversality condition is going to look like that second equation in the middle. But because debts are a part of this A, if you're going to impose the transversality condition, then automatically that tail has to be going to 0. This is very special to rep agent models. All right, this will OLG models, the no-Ponzi scheme condition, and the transfer, two different things. Okay, but here I think it's kind of necessary. So checking what I'm suggesting they should check, which is whether their fiscal policy satisfies this no-Ponzi scheme, it's kind of necessary to convince the reader that what we're seeing is not just like a mirage of the numerical solution and the grids we chose that kept the problem in a nicely well-defined playpen, but that actually this is the legit solution. All right, in the very little time that I have left, again, we'll talk about far more things afterwards, I want to just bring up a few more things to conclude, so some general thoughts, okay? I'm good. Okay, so this is very big picture. Is it enough? Does the transversality condition, does it give us reasonable amounts for what is the upper levels of debt that we could run? And here I'm going to put my Greek hat back on and tell you what happened with Greece when it got to its austerity program, okay? So here's the back of the envelope exercise. Greece, after it went through a savage austerity program, right now we're running about a 5% primary surplus. It was brutal, can be done. Now, if you take that number and you do the following back of the envelope, which is what is the debt to GDP ratio that the country can sustain if I'm not going to go all the way to 5, say 3 to 5% primary surpluses on average in the long run. I'm going to take a number from one of the authors of the paper, okay, where they said many, many years ago that the wealth to consumption ratio was 80. Multiply the two, you get ridiculously high levels for what would be a sustainable debt to GDP ratio. So that condition actually, in some sense, always gives too high debt capacities. It's basically like asking you, if I capitalize all your labor income for all your lives, what's the maximum mortgage you'd be able to afford? It would be a very big number. It would be multi-million numbers that you could afford if you capitalize your labor income and says, okay, that's your debt capacity. The issue is not whether people could potentially do that. The real issue is, would they sustain the pain of an austerity program that would allow them to repay these levels of debt? Let me remind you, Greece came very close to Grexit, okay? We came within an inch of stepping out, which would have been catastrophic for the country if that were to have happened. Okay, so people at some point say, I'm not really willing to do that. Okay, now, give me one more minute. All right. One more thing I want to say, that when you get into this region where you like start thinking to yourself, what is the level that like you can possibly sustain with debt, then the determination of what's the fiscal capacity becomes very murky, because you enter the land of multiple equilibria. Okay, like if it turns out that like the market sends you a big R, then you don't want to, then you'd have to raise very big surplus, and that's what you would. And so what I'm trying to say, I guess, here is that maybe not in this paper, but we should start thinking a little bit more along the lines of like, how much, the issue is not how much debt we could in principle sustain. The issue is how much would we want to sustain, okay? Okay, I had like more stuff to tell you about like where we are right now in the US and what is driving it. Long story short, these big projections that the CBO is doing that are very scary, where in this case you see debt to GDP blowing up. It doesn't come from their predictions that our primary deficit is going to explode. Most of it is because of this net interest outlays, their prediction that that's going to like be very high. And that mostly comes out of their predictions of what's going to happen to long-term GDP growth, okay? Which is obviously like a very hard thing to project. Okay, I'll leave you with that, and thank you so much.